Jacob Rees Mogg.
Mr. Robbins, can I first ask you about today's Daily Telegraph and a couple of extremely interesting comments that are attributed to, which you may wish to dissociate yourself from, and I at least want to give you that opportunity. First of all, he, that is to say you, argued that extending the transition period after Brexit would provide a more cast-iron escape route. Is that your view?
You'll expect me to say, Mr. Rees Mogg, that I'm not going to comment on an apparently leaked document, but it is certainly true that if the UK were to enter into an extension to the implementation period, some of the other negative consequences of being in the backstop that the chairman referred to at the beginning would not apply.
Thank you. Now, I thought you'd say you wouldn't comment on a leaked document, so I'll ask again whether it's your view on the next quotation, regardless of where it's come from. We should not forget that the backstop would, even with a UK-EU customs union, is a bad outcome with regulatory controls needed somewhere between GB and NI, serious and visible frictions and processes between GB and the EU, and no security cooperation provided for. Is that broadly your view?
All I can do is reiterate, Mr. Rees Mogg, that the backstop is definitely an uncomfortable outcome for both sides.
Well, at least for one side. Thank you.
I think for both, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Well, I'm not at all convinced about that they've got us exactly where they want us. And Secretary, can I come to you now? Because you mentioned that this would only be temporary. But temporary in EU terms can be quite a long time, can't it? Norway remained in a temporary agreement before the EEA was established for 22 years. So when the government says temporary, that's not a time-limited temporary.
Well, you're correct that people can take different interpretations, Mr. Rees Mogg, of temporary. The point is, what are the incentives? And what I alluded to earlier was, would the EU27 be comfortable with losing all access to our coastal waters on day one of a backstop? I don't think they would. I think that would be politically difficult. Would they be comfortable with the fact that businesses would have access to the single market without the vast sums that you and I campaigned against, without the freedom of movement? I don't think they would. Would they be comfortable with the litigation risk of firms claiming a trade distortion? Would they be comfortable with the potential disruption to their own future free trade agreements as they try and calculate those without having clarity as to what the population size on which those free trade agreements? So it is not perfect for either side, and if one doesn't, because I can see from your reaction, accept any of those safeguards, there is also, and this followed the work of a number of colleagues in government, a clear language in the political declaration in terms of things like the use of technology to expedite a solution. Because actually what we're really debating here is a huge focus on with the withdrawal agreement, which is the winding down element, and the backstop is a part of that. But the key opportunity for us is the future trade agreement. That is the way we get out, well, we try and avoid going into the backstop in the first place. But if that were to arise, and there's ways of avoiding it with the implementation period, but if it were to arise, the key is to move into the future trading relationship.
Your point, Secretary of State, on the backstop being sound attractive for them, surely is slightly contradicted by your suggestion earlier that no deal was possible without a backstop. If it's so bad, why did the EU insist upon it?
Because the EU cannot enter into a permanent relationship whilst we are still a member. And therefore we need to have exited in order to reach that future agreement. Now, one of the issues, which I'm sure you and I have, well, if I may just finish the point, please. One of the issues, I'm sure, as Brexiteers, you and I have often been lobbied about from business, is they don't want two sets of changes. They want to have one change. Now, if you come out on a no-deal situation with the World Trade basis, then one assumes one is also looking in the future for a free trading arrangement. Well, you are then into having more than one change. One of the attractions of the Prime Minister's deal, through having the implementation period, is not only do we give businesses greater certainty in the short term, up to the end of 2020, but then beyond that, when a change is made based on that future arrangement, it is done because we have left at the end of March.
But that assumes that no changes are made in the UK ex-Northern Ireland post the implementation period under the backstop, because you're saying that there would only be the one change, and therefore you're saying that the backstop would not allow GB to use its flexibility to change regulations.
No, what I'm saying is
otherwise there will be two changes. What doesn't exist.
What I'm saying is what I hear all the time from business is they want certainty, they want as much clarity as possible. In Parliament, we have had over the last week or so a huge focus on the withdrawal agreement and on the backstop. In essence, the winding down provisions of our relationship. What needs to be the focus and what the phase 2 discussions are about and what the mandate that is set out in the political declaration unlocks is actually the future relationship. And it is slightly paradoxical that we've had all this fixation on the backstop and the withdrawal and the winding down provision when actually as a Brexiteer, as an optimist for the future, as someone who wants to trade with the globe and actually look to the wider world, what we should be looking at is that future trading relationship.
There's an inherent contradiction there, isn't there, in saying that the EU couldn't use the facility under Article 50 to negotiate the future framework, that it can have a backstop without an end date, but it can't go further than that. It seems to be the EU can agree what it feels like.
No, I don't accept that. I think one of the features, and I always feel this whenever I read the European Union, the correspondence that particularly write on the European Union, what is always striking is how much their approach is informed by the legal process. And I think sometimes that's something we don't give sufficient weight to within the UK. And it is the legal process in Europe that a permanent relationship, a permanent trade arrangement cannot be reached until we have left. I am committed to ensuring, and the Prime Minister is committed to ensuring that we do deliver on that. We do leave the EU on the 31st of March, and by that point we're then in a position to be able to agree a trade agreement. But we can't do that before we have left.
It's not quite what your predecessor but one said. He said the trade agreement could be agreed a nanosecond after we'd left. It couldn't be formally agreed, but it could be negotiated.
Well, actually, I think, with respect, Mr. Rees Mogg, you're splitting hairs there, because the point I was making was you can't agree it until we've left. The point you have just said is it couldn't be agreed until we're left. Well, one can argue as to how quickly after leaving it can be agreed, but the point of law, as a former lawyer, the point of law still stands. The legal point, and I come back to the point that the EU takes a very much an approach, as I understand it, where its legal process is very important to it. And the point is you cannot agree as a matter of law, European law, until we've left. That's the point.
The history of the EU is that it's managed to adjust its legal process whenever it's needed to in other occasions.
Well, the law does evolve, of course.
Of course, and when it needed to bail out Greece, it suddenly found that laws didn't apply at all. But let's come to some specific points of Annex 2, Article 3, subsection 2. The United Kingdom will apply to its customs tariff may not, under any circumstances, which is lower than the common customs tariff for any good or import from any third country. When previously has the UK allowed for taxation without representation? Because the EU will be setting our customs taxes, and we will have no say on it once we've left.
You're talking in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
No, this is under the backstop. Annex 2, Article 3, subsection 2. Taxation without representation.
Well, I don't accept that at all. I've got that precise text in front, so I'll pick that up and happily write to you on it. But we've covered why the backstop is undesirable, we've covered why we have no desire to go into it, and we've covered the safeguards that there are in order to allow us to exit from it.
But if the EU raises tariffs, we will have to follow, and we will have no vote on that at all. So it is taxation without representation, a fundamental constitutional principle given away in the backstop.
No, I don't accept that at all.
Okay, but you don't seem to know about it, which is a bit of a problem. Can we go also then to Article 174, disputes raising questions of union law, because the government has consistently said that the jurisdiction of the ECJ will no longer apply once we have left, with the exception of citizens' rights. But this says that the arbitration panel shall not decide on any such question. In such case, it shall request the Court of Justice of the European Union to give a ruling on the question. This is not discretionary, this is absolute. But when you look at some of the things that will be included in the backstop, for Northern Ireland, specified EU law on VAT and excise, environment, electricity markets and state aid apply to the UK in respect of Northern Ireland with backstop, and they will all be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Can you explain how this squares with the government's stated view that we will be out of jurisdiction of the ECJ?
So I think there's a limited area in terms of Northern Ireland. So the single electricity market is distinct anyway. Firstly, that was a bilateral agreement before. So that was a bilateral agreement entered between Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the UK. So that wasn't actually done through the Commission, and there's very good reasons.
Under the ECJ.
It will.
Yes. So that's an addition to ECJ jurisdiction, rather than a subtraction in this agreement.
So there are, again, it comes back to my earlier point in terms of winding up issues. So there are, in terms of, this applies also to goods, which I think was inherent in your question, which is there are certain areas, the same actually applies in terms of citizens, where as part of the winding down arrangements there are certain rights in place, certain arrangements in place which are currently within the jurisdiction of the European Court, and that will continue within the backstop. I've touched already on the desire to come out of the backstop. But within Europe itself, VAT is not harmonised. There are variances within Europe. So VAT is not something that is static across. What European law says on VAT is it's around the minimum rate rather than the constant rate. So in the backstop, Northern Ireland would have to maintain the minimum VAT, which goes to the debate. For example, one sees in the press on things such as the tampon tax and whether that could be changed. So there is an issue in terms of Northern Ireland in terms of the minimum rate, but the UK obviously can align with that. So that's from a unionist point of view. That doesn't mean there's a distinction. But I think it would be misleading to suggest there is one VAT rate across Europe, because actually it's the minimum bit, not the harmonised bit.
I didn't begin to imply that, but you mentioned the tampon tax. That couldn't be removed in Northern Ireland under this, nor could VAT on domestic fuel be removed in Northern Ireland, and the European Court of Justice would adjudicate on that. That is all correct.
Well, we said in terms of the...
I just need to be the last part. Okay, but one final point after that. On that issue, the European Court will be ruling when the government has said we'll be out of jurisdiction of the court. So when the government says things, are we to assume that there is a footnote saying except in certain circumstances, because the government doesn't particularly footnote its comments? And my one final point is bring your attention to Article 4, because Article 4 is at the heart of this, because it establishes this treaty as superior law and requires that inconsistent or incompatible domestic provisions may be disapplied. So the suggestion that some members of the government could make, that if we don't like the backstop in the end, we can simply pull out of it, we would then be breaking domestic law, because we have agreed that this treaty should have the same status, the unusual constitutional status of the European treaties.
I mean, well, we will, and Parliament will get a very good opportunity to debate this in terms of the withdrawal, the WAB, in terms of the bill that is coming forward. But in terms of how that applies, you're correct in that there will be a direct effect element to those provisions, and so there will be in essence a reach into the bill. The bill will give direct effect to that element, but it is a very limited element, and it really goes to the heart of my reply to Mr. Crabb, which is there have been some limited compromises within this, but what matters here is the bigger picture. The specific circumstances of Northern Ireland have required some compromises, both because of the land border and because of the history in terms of the Northern Ireland peace and the Good Friday Peace Agreement. But that is very limited in its scope. Some of those actually predate, such as the single electricity market, actually predate this and were done on a bilateral basis. Some of it relates to the common travel area and how that interrelates. So there are bespoke issues in terms of Northern Ireland. Now, one can take a very purist approach and say that none of those compromises should be entered into. One shouldn't have arrangements distinct to the Northern Ireland situation. But I think actually what's probably, rather than my comments on this, if you look at the views of the business community in Northern Ireland, if you look at the views of the Ulster Farming Union, if you look at the biggest manufacturer in Northern Ireland, Bombardier, and the head of the Belfast plant, what you hear consistently from the business community in Northern Ireland is, yes, there have been some compromises, yes, there are some very limited areas, very limited, and we can all sort of play at sort of picking out individual bits of law where the courts have a reach. But actually the bigger picture here is this is a deal the business community in Northern Ireland support. This is a deal that the farming community, the farming union, the Ulster farmers support, and that is because they see the benefits, and indeed the same benefits that some in the EU 27 are concerned that businesses in Northern Ireland will have the best of both worlds, and that's why they support it.
Thank you very much.